Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. In the wake of the speech from the throne, we've had conservatives in particular talk about how they want implementation, which a speech like that would never actually give because it's all broad strokes. However, their idea of implementation is to repeal a whole bunch of previous liberal legislation that they are blaming for everything under the sun. All of this is pretty much nonsense, but I figure I would go through some of what they're calling for to be repealed in order to explain why some of this is nonsense. And the first one is, of course, the former Bill 69, which is the Impact Assessment Act. They have come up with a number of monikers about what this, or what they call this bill. It's not what it was. And there's a whole bunch of rhetoric around how the Supreme Court found it to be unconstitutional, which in fact they didn't. They found certain pieces of it to be unconstitutional. And the thing with repealing this kind of legislation is that it was actually like three different pieces of legislation into one. So repealing the whole thing would have all kinds of consequences for all this other stuff that it deals with, and not just project assessments. And the other thing to remember is that the whole point of this was to try and overcome some of the problems with these major project approvals, which was that they would get bogged down during consultation processes. And so the idea that they had put forward in this particular legislation was that you do the consultations up front, which includes with Indigenous people and so on, so that all of that is built into the design phase, everything from the proposal, and then you go smoother sailing from then on in. That doesn't really seem to be what the issue is. Of course, the issue that the Supreme Court struck down, the sections that they declared to be unconstitutional because it was a reference, so they couldn't actually strike anything down. However, were the fact that the federal government tried to assert federal jurisdiction over certain projects, particularly things like oil sands, under the rubric that the pollution from those goes nationwide and therefore needed a federal scope. Supreme Court didn't buy that argument. The federal government has already put through fixes to that, which have yet to be challenged, once again in the courts, however. But those were the parts that were declared unconstitutional, not the entire framework. And the other thing to remember is that with this particular legislation, the Conservatives in particular have blamed it for all kinds of projects not moving ahead, which were assessed under the previous Stephen Harper environmental assessment regime, not this particular legislation. Because once a project is underway, it stays under the same assessment regime as it started under. You don't change assessment regimes midstream, because that would be an invitation to all kinds of litigation. But the other thing is they like during the election they had this whole list of projects that they blamed the Trudeau government on for canceling or not approving, and some of those predated the Trudeau government entirely. So we need to take a lot of this with a grain of salt, and just to point out that this particular legislation has been blamed for a lot of things, which is not its fault. So a lot of what is also being blamed for is projects not moving ahead because the economics no longer work. When oil prices crashed after 2014, a lot of projects that were on the books that had approvals did not move ahead because it was no longer economical for them to do so, because the price of oil no longer merited the investment that those projects would require. But the Conservatives naturally will just add this to the list of things they blame the government for when that's not their fault. But these are things that they will blame this on this piece of legislation, and this legislation had nothing to do with it. One of the other things that they are also calling for the repeal of was a former Bill C-48, which is the offshore tanker ban on northern BC coasts. Again, there's some confusion, deliberate or otherwise, with this, because that only applies to products that have, and there's a phrase they use, just something like continuing, or something that essentially it needed to be like oil or diluted bitumen, which would be persistent in the environment, and not natural gas. So if you're talking about a natural gas pipeline to the northern BC coast, that would be fine because the tanker ban does not apply to LNG. And they keep insisting that LNG is what they want to ship to Asia to displace coal, which is not actually what's going to happen. But regardless, this is again a misleading thing that they will point to. There's also been this weird whole not quite a meme, but whole rhetorical thing that's come out recently, where these conservative pundits in particular want a pipeline to Prince Rupert, but Northern Gateway was only supposed to go to Kitimat, and if you read the assessment, it was because it was deemed too dangerous a route to go to Prince Rupert, which is why they said Kitimat. So you would think that people would actually, read a little bit about what they're talking about, but obviously they won't do that. On a related note, conservatives also say they want the emissions cap repealed, but they have been calling it a production cap, which it's not. And if you call an emissions cap a production cap, that seems to be admitting that the oil and gas industry's promises that they would reduce emissions and get to net zero by 2050 was not actually true, because that was the whole point of the emissions cap, was to basically call their bluff and tell them to either put up or shut up. The fact that they are saying it's a production cap seems to be belying that particular fact. The conservatives also want the electric vehicle mandates repealed, which seems a little weird. But I guess the logic there is that they want internal combustion engines always, so there will always be a market for oil and gas, which also, again, is a bit counterproductive and seems like, the whole protecting the buggy whip industry sort of argument. But again, this is where they are, and that's something to also just remember what they're talking about. This is what they're referring to. There's a whole second category of bills that they say they want repealed, and those are all justice-related bills, starting with the former Bill C-75, which was about reforming bail law. The thing about this bill is that it codified a whole bunch of Supreme Court jurisprudence on the law of bail, so if you repealed it, that jurisprudence would still be there, and that wouldn't actually change anything regarding the law of bail. The other thing that bill did was to actually toughen bail conditions and increase the reverse onuses for things like domestic violence. So if you repeal this bill, you are actually making it easier for people convicted or people arrested for domestic violence to get bail. So again, this bill is not doing what they say it did, and therefore we should really question when they say they want it repealed. On a similar note, a former Bill C-5 on house arrest. Again, they are claiming that this bill tells judges that repeat violent offenders are only to get house arrest, and that is not what happened. The bill says that judges will have a greater variety of sentencing options, which can include house arrest for nonviolent offenses. And if somebody violates that and commits a crime, well, then they also get the added charge of violating their conditions, and are unlikely to get house arrest ever again. So again, this is misleading in terms of what mandatory minimums mean and what sentencing options mean, and trying to conflate this with violent offenses or with bail. Again, house arrest is not bail. House arrest is when you've been convicted and the condition is instead of going to jail, you are to stay in your own home, and you have usually ankle bracelets and so on that would track you. Again, you're conflating two different things, usually done with ill intent or in bad faith. And again, the other thing I find just really curious about the objection to house arrest is that during the lockdowns during the pandemic, they were these same conservatives were so concerned that the lockdowns, and they were never actually lockdowns, were this violation of people's human rights, but it's too good for criminals at the same time. So again, your rhetoric's not really matching on there either. There's one more bill that they keep bringing up about, which is a former C-83, which they claim allows violent killers in prisons to get reduced security classifications and go from maximum to medium security and so on. And they name Paul Bernardo and so on and say that this is the legislation that allowed it, and that is absolutely false. That particular piece of legislation was about ending solitary confinement in prisons because it was found to be an abuse of human rights. And instead it was supposed to create these so-called structured intervention units, which was not supposed to be solitary confinement, and in practice, oh look, it's solitary confinement. And so that's going to be a whole other series of court challenges. But again, this is another example of a bill where the conservatives are claiming something that is absolutely not true, and repealing it would not do the thing they said it would do, and would cause all kinds of other problems. And so, again, when they're talking about repealing this legislation, it's, we need to start correcting them and saying that that is not what this piece of legislation does. You are acting in bad faith. You are misinforming people. This is disinformation, not but disinformation. And that needs to be stood up to. And it would be great if ministers of the Crown could actually say these things. I did hear Sean Fraser, the new Justice Minister, actually say something to that effect with Bill C-70, the former Bill C-75, the bail reform law. But it's rare that they actually say these things and point out that these bills are not what the Conservatives claim they were, or that this legislation, because they're no longer bills because they were passed into law. And I keep finding it a problem that they refer to enacted legislation by the old bill numbers because those numbers get recycled. But aside from that fact, the fact that they keep demanding that these bills this legislation be repealed, when in fact it doesn't do what they say it's going to do, and just causes more problems, and nobody wants to call them on that, and that is a problem. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.